She thought it would be just another ordinary flight. First class, champagne on arrival, maybe a little turbulence, but nothing she couldn't handle. But the turbulence didn't come from the sky. It came from what she saw in seat 2B. Patricia Langford stopped cold the moment she stepped into the first-class cabin. She had boarded 100 flights like this before. Same airline, same seat, same quiet conversations between high-powered professionals. Everything was supposed to be familiar, controlled, polished. But today, something felt different. Her eyes locked onto the man already seated next to her, a black man in a tailored navy suit, laptop open, typing calmly, like he owned the sky. And something inside her shifted. She froze, just for a second. And that second was all it took to unravel everything. Her heels clicked sharply as she forced herself forward, dragging her Louis Vuitton carry-on with just a little too much force. She reached her seat and hesitated again. The man hadn't looked up. He hadn't acknowledged her. He just kept typing, completely absorbed in his work. That's when her lips tightened. He didn't fit the picture she had in her mind. He didn't look like someone who belonged there, not to her. First class was supposed to feel exclusive, predictable, safe. She cleared her throat and placed her designer handbag onto the seat with unnecessary emphasis, as if making a point. Then she turned and lowered herself beside him, back straight, expression locked in polite disapproval. He still didn't look up. That made it worse. She glanced around the cabin, discreetly of course, hoping someone else had noticed the so-called mistake. But no one seemed concerned. Not the businessmen reading newspapers. Not the young woman already tapping away on her phone 2 rows back. No one but her. So she decided to fix it. "Excuse me," she said, voice soft but firm, the kind that demanded answers without appearing aggressive. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Still, he didn't look at her. "Yes," he replied, flat and emotionless, then returned to typing. "That's it?" Patricia blinked. No apology, no explanation, no glance to double-check his boarding pass. Her hand tightened around the armrest. Something about his calmness infuriated her. She pressed the call button. A soft chime echoed overhead. A flight attendant appeared moments later, blonde, early 30s, warm smile. Her name tag read Emily. Patricia smiled too. The kind of smile people use right before saying something they know they shouldn't. "I think there's been a small mistake," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I believe this gentleman may be in the wrong seat." Emily glanced at the man, then tapped something into her tablet. A pause. "No ma'am, this is Mr. Stokes. His seat is 2B, and you're in 2A. Everything looks correct." That smile, the one Patricia had painted on, flickered. "Oh," she laughed, trying to recover. "I must have just assumed, well, never mind." Emily smiled politely and moved on. But Patricia didn't. She sat still, lips tight, breathing shallow. Her gaze flicked from Daniel Stokes to the seat in front of her, then to the aisle, then back to him. He was still typing, unbothered, like none of this mattered. And that made her furious. She had spent her entire life maintaining control of conversations, of rooms, of people. She didn't like feeling ignored. She didn't like the lack of submission. She especially didn't like how comfortable he looked in that seat. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was offended. And that's when she decided to escalate. But before I tell you what she does next, right at the moment everything starts to spiral. If you're already hooked, hit the like button and comment 9 below. Because what happens next? You will not believe how fast the tables turn. Her next move is what starts the fall. And by the time the plane lands, she won't just regret it. She'll be trending everywhere. Patricia's fingers drummed against the armrest, too precise to be casual. Her thoughts were racing. She had just been told this wasn't a mistake, but that couldn't be right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. First class was her space. She had earned it. She had built a life of control, status, and predictability, And right now, none of it was working. And the man beside her, Daniel Stokes, he was still typing. Still calm, still ignoring her, like she didn't exist. That was unacceptable. She exhaled slowly through her nose and pressed the call button again. Another soft chime. Another few seconds. Emily returned, same patient smile, but this time a hint of concern behind her eyes. Yes, ma'am? Patricia lowered her voice just slightly. I'd like to request a seat change, she said. Emily blinked. Is something wrong with the seat itself? No, Patricia said quickly. It's not the seat. I don't feel comfortable. There it was. That phrase. Loaded, dangerous, calculated. Emily hesitated. The smile remained, but the warmth had cooled. I see, she said carefully. Well, let me check if there are any other seats available. Patricia nodded, folding her hands neatly in her lap, like a well-behaved schoolgirl. But her eyes were sharp, watching, waiting. Emily tapped on her tablet, her brows tightening ever so slightly. I'm afraid first class is full, she said after a moment. There aren't any open seats available. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. And in coach, she asked. Almost casually. Emily looked up. There are 2 available in economy, she replied. Patricia leaned forward slightly, tilting her head just enough to feign graciousness. Perfect, she said. He can take one of them. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was sharp. A few rows ahead, a man lowered his newspaper. Across the aisle, a woman blinked slowly, processing what she'd just heard. In the back, someone coughed, and someone else started recording. Emily didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Ma'am, she said, voice firmer now. Just to clarify, you're asking me to move another passenger from his assigned first-class seat because you're uncomfortable sitting next to him. Patricia didn't even flinch. Yes, she said. Emily inhaled the kind of breath people take before saying something they know will matter. That won't be happening. Patricia's face snapped toward her. Excuse me, Mr. Stokes has a valid ticket, Emily said. He's in the correct seat. I cannot and will not ask him to move. The air shifted. The judgment Patricia had hoped would fall on Daniel was now crashing down on her. She could feel it. Eyes turning. Phones lifting. People whispering. She straightened in her seat, trying to salvage control. This is ridiculous, she hissed. I'm just asking for an accommodation. If I feel unsafe, I should be allowed to sit somewhere else. That's standard. Emily's voice didn't rise, but it no longer bent. You're asking me to remove a black man from first class because of your discomfort. That's not an accommodation. That's discrimination. And just like that, the wave hit. A few people gasped. One man let out a quiet whistle. The young woman 2 rows back stopped pretending to text and openly pointed her phone at Patricia now. Daniel still hadn't spoken, still hadn't moved. But Patricia? She was unraveling. This is unbelievable, she muttered. Unbelievable. Emily didn't respond. She just stood there, the weight of the entire cabin behind her. Patricia's jaw clenched. She wasn't done. Not yet. She leaned toward Emily once more, dropping her voice to a whisper, but loud enough to carry. I don't feel safe, she said again. 3 words. That's all it took. 3 words to poison the air, to raise the stakes, to threaten everything. Emily froze. Daniel closed his laptop. Across the aisle, someone muttered, "Here we go again." And Patricia? She sat there, composed, convinced she had played her final card. But what she didn't know was that the real game had just begun, and her opponent wasn't playing to win. He was playing to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. A hush settled over the cabin, not the kind of silence that comes with sleep or comfort, but the kind that creeps in when something is about to go very, very wrong. Emily stood still, her professional smile gone. Daniel? He just sat there, hands folded over his laptop. Calm, silent, watching. Patricia adjusted her posture, making a deliberate show of sitting up straighter, like she was preparing to testify in court. Every movement calculated, every breath slow and purposeful. "I'm not saying he did anything," she began, her voice syrupy smooth. "I'm just saying I don't feel safe." It was bait. Emily didn't take it. Instead, she leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice just enough to make the moment feel intimate, private, even though the entire cabin was listening. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "are you saying you feel threatened?" Patricia gave the smallest shrug. Just enough to suggest something without actually saying it. Just enough to plant the seed. "I'm not saying that," she replied. I don't want to be difficult. But I believe someone else should be sitting here." Across the aisle, the man with the Bluetooth headset scoffed. He didn't hide it this time. He turned his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." 2 rows behind, a teenager whispered, "She's seriously doing this." Patricia could feel the shift happening around her. She felt it in the stillness of the passengers. The weight of eyes that refused to look away. The subtle betrayal of public opinion turning against her. But she pressed forward anyway. "This is a simple request," she said, louder now, "one I'm entitled to make." Emily's jaw tightened. "I already checked," she said. "There are no open seats in first class." "Then check again," Patricia snapped. Emily stared at her for a long moment, then calmly tapped on her tablet, scrolling through options she already knew didn't exist. "2 seats available," she said finally. "In economy." Patricia smiled. "Perfect. He can take one of them." This time the silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was nuclear. Daniel inhaled slowly, not in anger, not in disbelief, but like a man preparing to say something he said too many times before. He didn't speak. Not yet. Emily blinked, processing the sentence she'd just heard, making sure she understood it exactly as it was meant. "Ma'am," she said slowly, "you want me to move this passenger, who has done nothing wrong, to economy class, because you don't want to sit next to him?" Patricia nodded once, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. Emily's voice changed. Firm, unshakable. "That will not be happening." Patricia's head snapped back like she'd been slapped. "This is absurd," she hissed. "I've been flying with this airline for over 20 years. I've donated to your corporate foundation. I know your CEO." Emily didn't flinch. "This is about safety," Patricia continued, her voice rising. "And if I say I feel unsafe, that should be taken seriously." "It is," Emily replied, "which is why I'm asking you now, directly, if you believe you are in danger." Patricia froze. She couldn't say yes. Not legally. Not without consequences. But saying no would mean backing down. So she said nothing. And that said everything. Phones were out now. No one even tried to pretend they weren't recording. This wasn't just a scene, it was an event. And Patricia was center stage. The tension had built to the edge of collapse. And then Daniel moved. Slowly, deliberately. He turned his head and looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time. And Patricia. She froze. There was no aggression in his eyes. No frustration. No smugness. Just clarity. It was the look of someone who had seen this before. Lived it. Endured it. And knew exactly what to do next. He reached into his inner jacket pocket. Patricia's heart skipped. His hand moved slowly, calmly, and then he pulled out a slim leather case, flipped it open, held it up, and the entire cabin changed. A gold FBI badge glinted beneath the cabin lights. Sharp, unmistakable. Gasps, whispers, and then silence. Real silence. The kind that comes after a bomb goes off. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He just held the badge steady, his eyes locked on hers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm, steady, controlled. "Would you like to file an official complaint?" Patricia's lips parted, but nothing came out. Daniel didn't blink. "I can take your statement right now," he said. And that was the beginning of the end. Patricia couldn't speak. Her jaw tightened. Her throat closed. The words she had been preparing, the outrage she had rehearsed, they were gone. And Daniel. He just sat there, badge still in hand, expression unreadable. It wasn't a power move. It was a reminder, a statement, a warning. This wasn't a man who needed to yell. This was a man who spoke through facts, credentials, and presence. And right now, his presence was deafening. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and suffocating. Passengers stared openly now, not in confusion, not even in curiosity, but in judgment. A few whispered to each other behind raised hands. One man 2 rows ahead chuckled low under his breath and muttered, "Oh, this is priceless." The teenage girl with the phone, still recording, zoomed in now, capturing every inch of Patricia's face, the disbelief, the shrinking pride, the quiet panic rising behind her eyes. Daniel's voice cut through the silence like a razor. "You said you didn't feel safe," he repeated, calm as ever. "That's a serious allegation, especially on a federal flight." He tilted his head, just slightly. "If you believe I've done something inappropriate, I'll need your full statement, right now." Patricia's hands trembled in her lap. I, she croaked. She looked around, desperate for an ally, someone to save her from herself. No one moved. No one looked sympathetic. Not even Emily. The flight attendant stood nearby, arms crossed, face neutral, but her silence was louder than any words. For the first time, Patricia realized she had no cards left to play. No advantage, no audience, no control. And then it hit her. They were recording. They had been recording. This wasn't just a bad moment. It was a digital guillotine. Her face, her voice, her accusation, all of it documented, immortalized and spreading. Her stomach flipped. She shook her head, barely emotion. "No complaint," she whispered. Daniel nodded once, as if he had expected that. Then calmly closed the badge, tucked it back into his jacket, and reopened his laptop. Just like that, it was over. At least for him, for Patricia. The nightmare was only beginning. A few passengers clapped quietly, not for drama, not for entertainment, but for justice, for balance, for watching something that was supposed to stay hidden finally get dragged into the light. The man with the Bluetooth headset shook his head in disbelief, then returned to his newspaper. The girl with the phone, she was already typing. Patricia could feel it all crashing down. The air around her was heavy, thick with unspoken judgment. Her face burned, her chest tightened. Her hands dug into the seat's armrests like she was bracing for impact. But the plane hadn't even taken off yet. And somehow, she had already lost. She stared ahead, blinking fast, willing herself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. But the fear wasn't about embarrassment anymore. It was about exposure. About what was happening outside this plane, out there in the cloud. She felt her purse vibrate. Once, twice, 3 times. Each buzz a silent bomb. Text messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Call after call from friends, acquaintances, colleagues. Her name was already out there. The video was already online. The caption: "Racist woman tries to remove black man from first class, then learns he's FBI." Her hands went cold. She swiped open her phone with shaking fingers. 21 missed messages. Her name was trending. 30,000 views. Then 60. 97. It wasn't stopping. It wasn't slowing. It was wildfire. The kind that doesn't just burn reputations, it erases them. Patricia's mouth went dry. She blinked at the screen, numb. She had built a life on curated perfection, on good press, on polished appearances, and in less than 15 minutes, she had become a headline. Her face was a meme now, her voice, a warning, and her legacy, burning. Patricia gripped her phone so tightly, her knuckles turned white. 30 minutes ago she was untouchable. Now she was being chewed up and spat out by an algorithm. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to think like she used to in boardrooms. Calm, calculating, composed, but none of those skills mattered anymore. Not when her name was trending in bold. Not when the comment sections looked like a war zone. Karma caught a flight. She really thought she could whisper him away. FBI. First class. Fatal mistake. The plane hadn't even moved yet. And she was already living through the worst public humiliation of her life. Emily approached quietly. No clipboard, no tablet. Just a single quiet question. Ma'am, I need to confirm that you're okay to remain on this flight without further disruption. It was said softly, but it hit like a gavel. Patricia lifted her head. She wanted to scream, to demand why she was being treated like the problem. Why no one was defending her. Why her years of loyalty, donations, social status meant nothing here. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she forced a brittle smile and nodded. I'm fine, she whispered. Emily held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded and walked away. But Patricia's internal storm didn't settle. If anything, it intensified. Another vibration, another ping. She glanced at the screen, a text from her sister. Patricia, what did you do? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes scanned the plane, half expecting someone to be staring, smirking, whispering. But they didn't need to. They had already seen enough. The shame had gone viral. And now it was physical. In her chest, in her stomach, in her skin. The teenage girl with the phone, still recording, still capturing, but not with urgency anymore. With calm, like she knew the video didn't need more drama. Just time. The pilot's voice broke through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Patricia blinked. Takeoff. She had forgotten the plane hadn't even left the ground. How was that possible? How had her life unraveled in less time than it took to reach cruising altitude? She clutched her purse, reached inside for her compact mirror, and caught her own reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot, her lipstick cracked at the edges. She didn't look like herself. Not the version she curated on social media. Not the version she presented at galas. Not the woman who smiled for foundation press releases. She looked like someone who had just been exposed, unmasked. And deep down, she knew this wasn't the kind of scandal you recovered from with a half-hearted apology and a few weeks offline. This was the kind that stuck, because it wasn't just the video, it was what the video revealed. Entitlement, prejudice, abuse of privilege, and the worst part, she said it all with a smile. Patricia turned her phone over face down on her lap. She didn't want to see the notifications anymore. She didn't want to see her name trending. She didn't want to read the tweets or the articles or the Instagram stories from people she once knew, now pretending they never did. But denial couldn't save her, because just as the wheels of the plane lifted from the ground, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a number she recognized. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? A short silence. Then a cold clipped voice. Miss Langford, this is James Rawlins, chair of the Marston Foundation. Her stomach dropped. I assume you're aware of the situation, he said. Her throat tightened. James, we're going to need you to step down, he interrupted. Her mouth opened, searching for words. But this is being taken out of context. The board disagrees, he said, voice flat. There will be a statement by morning. We expect your resignation tonight. Then click. The line went dead. Patricia stared at her phone. The Marston Foundation had been her crowning jewel, her pride, her sanctuary. Gone. Just like that. No trial, no explanation, no second chances. Just judgment, delivered via Bluetooth. And outside her window, the clouds looked beautiful, peaceful, cruel. Daniel hadn't said another word. He didn't need to, because his silence was louder than anything she could say now. And somewhere on the ground, on 1,000 glowing screens, the video was still spreading. Patricia wasn't just living through a fall, she was watching it happen from inside the story, and the world was watching with her. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, but to Patricia, it felt like crashing into concrete. She hadn't spoken since the call, hadn't moved. Just sat, frozen in 2A, watching the clouds drift past the window as her reputation burned thousands of feet below. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers stirred. The man with the Bluetooth headset stood and stretched, clearly ready to pretend this flight never happened. The teenage girl with the phone, still filming, still waiting, still capturing her final shots like a documentarian, watching the final scene of a documentary titled The Fall of Patricia Langford. Daniel, still silent, still calm, still unreadable. He closed his laptop with quiet finality, placed it back in his bag and stood. Patricia remained seated, frozen. She wanted to vanish, but the world wasn't going to let her. The moment the cabin doors opened, she moved fast, almost frantic, grabbing her purse, yanking her carry-on from the overhead bin with too much force. She didn't even say goodbye. She just needed to get out. But as she stepped into the terminal at Reagan National Airport, she stopped cold. Cameras, microphones, reporters, they were waiting. A young woman in a navy blazer held a phone in one hand and a mic in the other. She glanced up, recognized Patricia instantly, and lit up like a match. That's her. That's the woman from the flight. Patricia's chest caved in. She turned sharply, trying to disappear into the crowd, but it was too late. The reporter surged forward. "Miss Langford, can you comment on the video? Do you deny making the statement about not feeling safe?" More voices joined in. "Do you think it was appropriate to ask a federal agent to move seats? Are you stepping down from the Marston Foundation?" Patricia broke into a near run, her heels clicking wildly against the tile floor. She pushed past travelers, her head ducked, breath shallow. Her phone buzzed violently in her purse. Texts, emails, missed calls, her name plastered across every news feed and social platform. She reached the curb and flung open the door of the first taxi she saw. "Go," she gasped. "Now." The driver raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. The door slammed, the car pulled away, and Patricia sank into the seat like the weight of the day was physically crushing her. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't scream. She just sat there, dead silent. The driver said nothing. The radio played softly in the background, news, ironically. The viral video from earlier today appears to show a woman attempting to remove a black man from first-class seating, unaware he was an FBI agent en route to testify before Congress. Patricia's stomach turned. Her name wasn't mentioned yet, but it was coming. She pulled out her phone. 93 missed texts, 4 voicemails, and then a new tweet. A quote from the teenage girl who filmed everything. "She looked me dead in the eye and said she didn't feel safe. I hope she feels this now." Below it, 1.4 million likes, hundreds of thousands of retweets. Her name was now trending with 2 hashtags, #Patricia Langford, #privilege, in first class, and it got worse. A journalist had dug into her history, archived posts, past interviews, donations. Moments she thought had disappeared in the folds of the internet were now being weaponized against her. 10 years of social climbing, undone in 10 minutes of silence and entitlement. Then her phone buzzed again. A name she didn't recognize. She hesitated, answered. "Hello? This is Rachel Nguyen, senior producer at GBC News. We'd like to invite you on air to clarify your side of the story." She couldn't even respond. She hung up. She couldn't fight this, not when the court of public opinion had already ruled and rendered her guilty. Patricia stared out the window. Billboards, traffic, pedestrians, everything still looked normal, but she wasn't part of that normal anymore. She was viral, she was infamous. And the scariest part, she hadn't even seen the worst of it yet, because just hours later, Daniel Stokes would appear on national television, quiet, composed and devastatingly honest, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with purpose. 3 days later, Patricia Langford sat alone in her high-rise condo. Curtains drawn, phone off, laptop closed. She hadn't stepped outside since the video went viral. Not once. Food delivery left at the door, calls unanswered, emails unread. Her name was still trending. She had issued a short, robotic apology through a PR rep full of words like misunderstanding and regret, but no one cared. Not really, because the video said enough. The silence she left after saying "I don't feel safe" screamed. But what broke Patricia wasn't the backlash. Wasn't even the career loss or the resignation letters she'd signed in tears. It was what came next. She hadn't meant to watch it. She told herself she wouldn't. But there it was, on every homepage, every news site, every social feed, live from Capitol Hill. Agent Daniel Stokes testifies before the Senate. He walked into the chamber wearing the same Navy suit, calm, composed, untouched by the noise. He looked exactly the same as he had on the flight, but this time he had the world's attention. He sat, adjusted the mic, and spoke. "I'm not here today to talk about what happened on that plane," he began. "I'm here to talk about what happens every day, in offices, on sidewalks, in elevators, and yes, on flights." The room fell silent. Senators leaned forward. Journalists scribbled furiously. Viewers at home stopped scrolling. "We talk about national security," he said, "but we rarely talk about psychological safety. The right to exist in a space without having to justify why you belong there." Patricia watched from the couch, frozen. The sound of his voice filled the room, and it wasn't angry. It was steady, unshaken, unapologetically clear. "I've been a federal agent for over 14 years. I've served this country, protected its leaders, tracked threats across borders. And yet, I still get asked if I'm in the right seat." The chamber was still, not a cough, not a paper rustle, just truth. He continued. "The woman on that flight didn't need to say anything overt. Her discomfort was enough. Her implication was enough. And in another time, another place, her word alone might have been enough to remove me. Or worse." Patricia's chest tightened. He hadn't said her name. Not once, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew. He ended with a sentence that would echo for months. "My badge doesn't protect me from suspicion, but I hope my voice helps protect others from silence." The room broke into applause. Even some senators, ones who rarely clapped, stood. The clip would go viral within minutes. Not the scandal, not the fall, but the rise, the dignity, the power of restraint, the message. Back in her condo, Patricia sat motionless. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even embarrassed. She was gone. Not physically, but publicly, socially, culturally. Her name had become a cautionary tale, not because of what she did, but because of how calmly the world watched her unravel and chose to listen to someone else instead. She was no longer the main character. She was the lesson. And Daniel, he never posted the video, never bragged. He didn't have to. The world did it for him. The teenage girl who filmed the moment would later become a civil rights attorney. The flight attendant, Emily, would be interviewed on national TV, quiet, composed, just like Daniel. And the man who stayed silent on a plane, while injustice tried to whisper him away, he became a symbol, not of resistance, but of resolve, of what it looks like to rise above rage and still change the room. So if this story made you think, share it. Not for the views, not for the outrage, but because somewhere, someone will recognize this moment and realize they're not alone. They've been in seat 2B. Now they know they don't have to move ever again.